Russell Wilson benched by the Denver Broncos in the I don't know what classification we're using for this in terms of whether we're like what we're going to call it. It's like the financial bench for financial reasons. I mean, that's what the reporting is. I believe Ian Rappaport of NFL Network reported that. Do you buy that it's purely financial, that there's not some
well, I'm
motivation here?
I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but it seems like if Jared Stidham is signed to your team in the offseason, that's the ultimate kiss of death, right? This is the same scenario that Derek Carr went through last year. Let's not forget, right? 2 games left in the season for financial reasons, because if he gets injured and isn't able to pass a physical, his money becomes guaranteed. Same thing with Russell Wilson, right? 2 games left in the season, essentially out of the playoffs. We're not going to play Russell Wilson. We're going to bench him just in case he gets hurt and can't pass a physical in March 2024. Who's the backup quarterback in both of those scenarios? Jared Stidham. So beware. Jared Stidham signs to your team, you're on the clock.
Oh, no. Here's the odd thing is if he ends up being the backup for the game, that's what doesn't make any sense.
Correct.
Where he still could go in and get injured if Stidham gets hurt or something happens along the course of the game. So that's the only part of it I don't understand. If he's not going to be out there, make him inactive.
I think they will.
That was my thought, too, and that's why I don't anticipate him being the backup for this.
Honestly, he probably won't even be in the building because, remember, Derek Carr kind of got away from the team when that happened. So,
Derek Carr and Marcus Mariota both quit the team last year when they got benched.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I quit the team. I mean, sometimes people feel like, hey, if they're moving on, you'd rather than be out of sight,
the Band-Aid
out of
off.
mind. Yeah.
I mean, Derek Carr acted like a little emo kid and ran away with, that'd be nice to me.
Emo. So what did Marcus Mariota do then?
He acted like a quiet emo kid.
Quiet emo kid.
I don't know. I thought Derek Carr.
It's getting to the point where I think you can now look at it and say the Russell Wilson Denver Broncos experiment, it didn't work. Obviously not with Nathaniel Hackett. Sean Payton's now had a year with him under his wing. He doesn't feel like he's performed good enough, which is ironically because this is a defense that if you look at their rankings, vastly improved from where they were earlier this year, especially versus the Dolphins. But around the quarterback position, it's not like he's had the best supporting cast all season. On top of it, statistically, he's been much improved from last year. And not that bad when you compare him to the numbers of Patrick Mahomes or some of the others we're talking about. So I don't want to say he's the fall guy in this case, but it just felt like Sean Payton kind of gave it a try. And now we move on to a point where they're going to be going their separate ways. Now, that being said, it's odd because I would have thought maybe they make this move after they're actually eliminated from the playoffs. I know they have like a 1% chance, but still it just hits a little bit different when they still actually have a chance of making it in.
And the thing that's interesting too, Brady, if you look at their offense from where it was last year, they're still middle of the pack. They're like ranked 16. So it's not like you're getting bottom third football on the offensive side of the ball. Now, again, they haven't been explosive. They are who they are. They're going to run the ball, play action pass. Cortland Sutton's going to get 3 or 4 jump balls a game. They're going to try to hit Jerry Jeudy on some intermediate routes, and they're going to screen game you to death. And maybe that's why Sean Payton feels away, because he feels like they're just too generic, and he can't take that next step with the current roster they have right now, more specifically the quarterback position. But to your point, right, it's night and day from what it was last year, and the defense has played a lot better. Struggled the last 2 games on the defensive side of the ball, so can't just put this all on Russell Wilson in the offense.
I think the hard thing for Sean Payton is if you look at his track record of offensive success with Drew Brees and the Saints, he cannot run that offense with Russell Wilson the way he did with Drew Brees.
Not at all.
And I think if that was the thought of him coming in there and that was how they're going to be able to have success, I just don't think it fits maybe what Sean Payton wants to do, and it probably doesn't play to the strengths of what Russell Wilson can do.
For sure.
I think it's interesting how you cover this league long enough, you can sort of follow it, read the tea leaves, read between the lines, if you will. And I mean, look, the read between the lines thing for me here is that they are going to do something completely unprecedented and eat a ton of salary cap space this offseason, or a ton of dead cap money. Use up dead cap money use up salary cap space on dead cap money, getting rid of Russell Wilson and moving on. And I think the other thing is, you saw it in the preseason. Sean Payton hyping up Russell Wilson, saying we're going to go to the playoffs. It was clear that he has sort of bought in to the idea that he could make Russell Wilson work. And now that it's not working and they're missing the playoffs, he's decided to let everybody know that this is Russ's fault by virtue of benching him the final 2 games of the season.
I don't know if it's that well. I just think when you're Sean Payton and you're put in this position, and you know this, Brady, sometimes coaches come into situations where they don't have much leeway in what they can do. The way that Russell Wilson's contract was kind of drawn up, like Sean Payton had to give it at least a year, right? There was nothing else he could do. He couldn't just move off on him. And it's even a surprise now with the number that he has next year that they're going to go ahead and rip the Band-Aid off. That lets you know that new ownership wants to really revamp and restart this thing. And it's also interesting, will they essentially act like next year is Sean Payton's like first year instead of this year? Because he's going to have to restart everything from the quarterback position and probably change up some other parts on offense as well. So if you're Sean Payton, I don't know if he was actually all the way in on Russell Wilson anyway, because I talked about this, Brady, the marriage between him and Russell Wilson. If you look at Russell Wilson and how he plays, a lot of off-script stuff, doesn't like to throw in timing. But when he was with Drew Brees, that's what Drew Brees did really well. He threw in timing, and that's what Sean Payton wants his quarterback to do. And I knew Russell Wilson was never going to do that. So I always wondered where the tug of war was going to be between these two guys. Would Sean Payton give a little and, you know, do some things Russ likes to do, but then also try to get Russell Wilson to throw in timing? Russ still never threw in time, and so Sean Payton ultimately had to give up on his offense and change the offense. I don't think he ever really truly wanted to do that.
I think that's also part of the frustration for a lot of play callers is, you know, when you call a play and it's there and the quarterback isn't executing it the way you want to, it then makes it extremely difficult to then operate and feel overly confident calling anything.
Yeah.
And so when you do have some off-script plays that end up going your way, in your mind as a coordinator, you're like, great, but the reality is that only lasts so long in the NFL. And so whether it's, in this case, Sean Payton, Russell Wilson, or I remember like Josh Dobbs earlier this season when he got to Minnesota, he had a couple plays, took off, scrambled, run, went in, and you could tell Kevin O'Connell was almost like reluctant to like be like, great, because I think he knew at some point this isn't going to last or this isn't going to help us ultimately win in the end. But look, it will be a post-1 June designation, I think, if they can't trade him and if they decide to cut him. The reality is, though, is, you know, you don't know that it's Sean Payton ultimately making the decision. Maybe it's someone within the Walton family that's taking on what could be an astronomical cap hit / you know, dead cap money. But when you got Walton money, I mean, it ain't that bad.
Do what you do when you're popping.
Yeah, and maybe there's an ownership portion into this decision where they're coming in saying, this is the wise decision, protect our downside in the event he gets hurt. We feel like this relationship isn't going to be able to work moving on after this year. And it feels like that's where they're at right now.
So just for clarification on the numbers and sort of the logic here is Russell Wilson, if he were to suffer an injury that wouldn't allow him to pass an exit physical at the end of the year, he on March 17th, I believe, his contract. There we go. Yeah, it would be fully guaranteed if he can't pass a physical by early March. And so basically the Broncos are trying to get out of, you know, this extra $37 million in cash that they would owe Russell for the future. They already are going to have to pay him $39 million in cash. And to Brady's point about, which is, you know, just the salary for next year, I believe. So $85 million in dead cap money in terms of the 2024 season if they were to cut him before June 1st. If they release him post June 1st, there'd be $35.4 million in dead cap space for the team in 2024 and $49.6 million in dead cap space for the team in 2025. If they can trade him before June 1st, $68 million in dead cap space, and their cap savings would be negative $32.6 million. Pretty insane.
Nobody's trading for that contract.
Right, exactly. A post-June 1st trade, just for the record, would be $18.4 million in dead cap space, saving them $17 million, but $49.6 million in dead cap space for next year. So this is truly unprecedented. You know, we've seen this with Carson Wentz. We've seen it with, I think, the Packers, you know, we're thinking about eating cap space for Aaron Rodgers. We've seen it with, you know, teams have just been willing to eat these giant cap hits to move on from these mistakes, but this would be completely unprecedented.
Yeah.
Well, they can eat the cap numbers because they can afford it with the money that they're bringing in right now to the new TV contract. That's the reality of it. And you're also talking about an organization with a new ownership group that's one of the wealthiest families in the world. So,
well, yeah, cash-wise, but I mean, I'm talking like if you're taking $49 million dead cap hit. Your salary
It's gonna
cap.
be struggle to put a roster out there next year.
You're operating like the Oakland A's out here.
No, and then there's truth to that, but then you look at an organization like the Rams and what they've done, basically building around Matt Stafford, Aaron Donald, and Cooper Kupp, and you see how that works out. So it can be done, and I think that's maybe one of the reasons too, where they're a little bit more bullish on what that's going to look like in the future if they can find Sean Payton with the quarterback that would fit more of what he wants to do. I think it's more interesting if you think about, like, if he could get traded, obviously Denver might be on the hook for a portion of that contract, and that's maybe how the trade gets done, because maybe they don't want to absorb that cap hit, even if it is a post-June 1 designation for cutting him. So the reality is, who would be potential fits? Well, I would look at Tampa and say, well, Dave Canales was with him as quarterback coach in Seattle, but Baker Mayfield's having such a good year, you're going to get him a much better discount, and I think you want to continue that momentum. Sure. So that's not really a fit. You look at their offensive coordinator in Seattle now, Shane Waldron. Maybe he would look at potentially going somewhere else as a head coach and want to bring him in and see if he can't revamp some of that. He's worked with Brian Schottenheimer, who's now in Dallas. I don't think the Cowboys are moving on from Dak Prescott. They've already got Trey Lance sitting there too. You start looking at some of the different places, and with a loaded quarterback class with Caleb Williams and Drake May and maybe Jaden Daniels and Michael Penix and whoever else we want to throw into the conversation, much cheaper options. Right. I think at a minimum, if you're not talking about a trade and just signing him as a free agent, but either way, probably much cheaper options coming into the league. So it will be fascinating to see if he gets released, who ends up being a suitor, or if he gets traded, who would be interested in bringing on that contract and what those details look like in the trade.
Do you think that there's a possibility if he does get released that he could potentially retire?
I don't know about that. I think he's got aspirations outside of football, off the field, and whether it's being on TV or anything else, like he'd be successful at that. I think the question is more of, would he be interested in being a bridge quarterback, whereas someone might only bring him in for a year or two short-term deal to then prove it? Does he want to go through that scenario? I think in one
like Carson Wentz.
At one side, you've obviously done enough in the league where you feel like you shouldn't be in that position. But on the other end of it, like, if you have to prove it, so be it. You've already, you might say, I've made enough money, I can gladly go prove it for a year and maximize on the back end of it. It really comes down to where he sees himself personally outside of the game of football and how he sees his future, in my opinion.
He's now going to. He's now going to have had Pete Carroll and Sean Payton give up on him in the span of less than 3 years, which is not great.
Well, two of the greatest coaches in NFL history.
Yeah, which is
Hall of Fame coaches, in my opinion.
And you were talking about Canales and Shane Waldron. That's the thing. When Waldron came over there, more of that West Coast offense, it was more timing based. And that's where Russell really struggled the last couple of years in Seattle. That's why they kind of wanted to move off of him. So I don't think Canales would look at him in Tampa. And if Shane Waldron were to get a job, I don't think he would probably look at him either. It'd be interesting to see what Seattle does with Geno now. Again, if he finishes the season strong and they go into the playoffs, I think he still is the quarterback of the future. But he has been banged up this year, and I know a lot of people have been asking, will Seattle look at a quarterback potentially in the draft? So
look at the other potential quarterbacks that could be traded, right? Like, I don't think the Bears should trade Justin Fields, but they are going to have probably the number 1 overall pick. So if they do and they want to take a quarterback, they could. Would you rather have Fields? Would you rather have Russell Wilson? Given either
upside, I think
Fields' current contract situation, he probably will need an extension at some point, but you have some control. With Wilson, at least what you're dealing with. So there's a lot of nuances to it. I think there's a number of veteran quarterbacks, too, who could be in that conversation of, hey, who am I in competition with to trade for? Who do we want to go trade for if we're looking for a quarterback next season?
What do you think about Will's team, Carolina, potentially bringing him in if he gets released?
It's fascinating to see. Obviously, we got to see who the head coach is first. Correct. I think that's where we get a sense for, what they're trying to do. I personally feel like, based on what David Tepper has said, they're still in on Bryce Young. You bring a guy who's won a Super Bowl, been to 2 Super Bowls. I don't think that's sending that message. That's sending a different message.
I got you. Even the Raiders could potentially be a spot too, I think. With Aiden O'Connell.
Well, and let's not forget, like, if you bring him into Carolina, then David Tepper would be admitting that the Bryce Young thing failed, and I think someone else is going to get fired for that first. Maybe several people get fired for that first.